Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Schwab-Cartas, and Casey Burkholder, Funkiale Jebi, and I recently edited a book with Routledge called Facilitating Community Research for Social Change, Case Studies in Qualitative, Arts-Based, and Visual Research. Today, Casey and I have the great pleasure of talking with Tobin LeBlanc Haley and Laura Pin about their chapter, Injustices in Incentives Facilitating Equitable Research with People Living with Poverty. Their chapter takes up the concerns with providing honoraria to research participants, which is a well-established practice in academic research. Honoraria typically serves as a thank you, as a small recognition of labor of participants without whom, of course, research would be impossible with, and as an incentive to research participation. Yet scholars in Canada do research with people living in poverty. Thus, provisioning of the honoraria is a complex and sometimes contested process due to the guidelines around incentives in the Tri-Council policy statement and the university practices related to administration of research funds. In this chapter, the authors consider the impact of dual pressures of the TCPS2 language around incentives and practices of university financial services on the research process and research relationships through an autoethnographic exploration of authors' experiences as community-based academic researchers in Ontario, Canada. Tobin and Laura contend that there is an opportunity to address these issues as universities and funding agencies work to foreground equity, diversity, and inclusion in their strategic plans. They end their chapter with recommendations for change.
So we have a few questions for you. First, what do we know about facilitation?
So as scholars who work with structurally marginalized communities, and I think a lot of the folks who are writing chapters for this really exciting collection are also working with structurally marginalized communities, and hopefully folk who are reading this as well, who are interested or who are doing work with structurally marginalized communities. For us, when we think about facilitation, certainly in relation to incentives into this chapter specifically, we see how the communities that we work with are often over-researched. And we really want to highlight the role, and we're drawing on the work of other scholars who have done this, the role that incentives or sort of small payments in contribution, in a recognition of the contribution of the work that research participants are doing, can really play in facilitating the inclusion of people with lived experience in research. And there are scholars who've written about how this can lessen the burden of participation, so such as time away from work to participate in a research project, or time away from other socially necessary activities like childcare, that an incentive can play in facilitating that labor. And then also the ways in which incentives can disrupt, like a small and symbolic way, the hierarchies between research and participants. And so our work on facilitation is about building on what those scholars like Sheff and Thompson have already brought to the table that they've allowed us to know and to really consider. Our work is to build on that to ensure equitable, sustainable, and inclusive access to the research process for the folks that we work with, and to really draw on what we know about facilitation from those scholars who are working with structurally marginalized communities in order to make that process happen.
I guess to follow up, what does your chapter teach us about facilitation?
So as Tobin mentioned, our chapter draws on our experience working together with people experiencing homelessness and poverty in Ontario. And I would say the main takeaway from our chapter is that institutional processes are rarely designed to facilitate equitable inclusion of people with lived experience of structural marginalization in research. So focusing specifically on the process of paying participants an incentive, we talk about 3 institutional barriers to facilitating the participation of people with lived experience. First, institutional reporting requirements. around these payments often fail to consider the unique and overlapping structural vulnerabilities of people experiencing poverty, disability, people who are Indigenous, and people who are undocumented. For example, in the case of Indigenous people in Canada, there's a long ongoing history of intrusive data requests from state institutions and experiences of policing and state violence. They may experience these requests for documentation from the university as particularly intrusive. Second, institutional incentive guidelines often propose compensating people with lived experience at lower rates than other participants to avoid coercion. In the chapter, we suggest that there are much better ways to avoid coercion, like paying an incentive before data collection starts, reminding people they can keep their incentive of payment even if they do not participate in the research process. These methods that don't minimize the significance of the research contributions from people with lived expertise by paying them a lower incentive amount. Finally, we raise concern that the primacy accorded to the enforcement of tax law and CRA guidelines in institutional practice often outweighs institutional obligations to safeguard participant confidentiality. Things like collecting and sharing legal names, addresses, and social insurance numbers for the purposes of issuing T4 slips, so for tax purposes when not required. We suggest that this is a violation of participant confidentiality as well as a collection of unnecessary personal data that has to be managed and can lead to significant negative consequences for research participants, especially those that experience intensive state surveillance when accessing the basic necessities of life.
Thank you so much. So what else do we need to consider in relation to facilitation in a research for social change framework?
Yeah, and these questions are why this volume is so exciting. So we are so happy that universities are supporting and contributing to excellence in community engaged and participatory action research. But we really do need to have broader conversations within the academy about the role of the universities in facilitating incentive use and what it means to provide incentives that do facilitate community participation from structurally marginalized groups. Certainly, it is key that people not feel coerced into participation, and that as researchers, we explain our use of incentives to our REBs and get approval to ensure that all ethical requirements are met and all ethical guidelines are being followed. However, sometimes we think that the conversations about incentives and existing institutional processes around incentive use are based on more of a one-off approach to data collection with human participants, rather than research models that involve working in and with community over the long term. In the kinds of research that we do and that other contributors to this volume do, where those long-term relationships with community members are built and where we consult with people continuously over the use of their stories and their insights and their experiences and their data, we feel it's vital that people be provided with an incentive that reflects what's often called the burden of participation. And this is really where we'd like to see the conversation go as universities continue to foreground the importance of community engaged and participatory action research.
Thank you both so much for speaking with us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much for your wonderful contribution and for this wonderful chapter. Thank you.